We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Paisani, and I work at Carla, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's presentation. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to point your attention to the slide on the screen. We have three more talks following this one today. Our next one is on March 6th. If you are interested in attending any of these talks, please go to the URL that's shown on the slide. There's also a QR code that you can scan, and Karen has just put the link for registering in the chat. We use a different Zoom room for each of the talks, so you need to register separately for them. You'll notice that the talk on March 6th, as well as the one today, the topics are related to Carla's Social Justice in Language Education initiative. We have been sponsoring this initiative for the past 5 years, and we are committed to continuing to support social justice and DEI-oriented work through this initiative, and we are really glad that you are here today to be a part of that. We are so excited to welcome Jason Martell here today. Jason is a longtime friend of Carla and the University of Minnesota. He's a graduate of the PhD program in multilingual education here. He is a member of the evaluation team for Carla's current LRC grant, and he's also a well-respected scholar and teacher educator. His work spans content-based instruction, which he's going to talk about today, teacher education, IPA assessments, all different kinds of things. And his work is always really careful and really interesting and really well researched. He's one of the most well-read people that I know. If you don't know about his book, this came out 2 years ago. Jason, did it come out in 2023?
I think it was 2022 now. My time has
2022. So
flown.
this is
Yeah.
Jason's book on content-based instruction that was published by Routledge. It's in their guides series, so it's really digestible. So if you are content-based instruction curious, I highly recommend this. What I love about it is that Jason talks about CBI in a way that is not just specific to immersion or sort of learning content through language, but also learning language through content. So it's really relevant for world language educators. The title is Moving Beyond the Grammatical Syllabus, Practical Strategies for Content-Based Curriculum Design. I'll put it in the chat when I'm done with this really, really long introduction. So anyway, we're so happy to have Jason here. The title of his talk is Negotiating a Language Focus in a Content-Based Unit on Food Insecurity. We will leave the chat open. Please feel free to use that to back channel. We'll also ask you to put any questions you have for Jason into the chat, and I'll put a reminder about that as we go along. Welcome, Jason.
All right. Thank you so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction. It's really kind words you said. I appreciate it. And thank you to the whole Carla team for setting this up and for inviting me to be on the evaluation committee. That's been such a joy. I get to see these reports of all the amazing work that Carla's doing, and just to see the reach that Carla has in our community. Um, so, like Kate said, I did my PhD in Minnesota, and so doing anything with Carla feels like a homecoming to me. I love being able to be associated with this organization, and I'm so happy to be here. Um, so, as Kate said, my talk is called Negotiating a Language Focus in a Content-Based Unit on Food Insecurity. And to start, I thought I'd just share a little bit about my background. So, I sort of came up as a French teacher. My first professional work was teaching high school and middle school French in a suburb of Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts, south of Boston. And how I got into content-based instruction kind of goes back all the way to that time. So I think it was my third year of teaching. One of my colleagues just hated using the textbook we were using for her French 3 course. I don't remember, it was Discovering French. I think it was the Rouge. Some of you are probably familiar with that one. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the step on the snake moment. It was like in a vocab list, there was like somebody was hiking and oops, they stepped on a snake. And she's like, when are my students ever going to say this? And so they scrapped the curriculum and started designing some homemade curriculum. And that was the first time I saw other people diverge from a textbook, really. And then I got to teach that course the next year, and I really got into designing curriculum and was really interested in bringing a critical thinking focus to it. And so started digging around online, and where did I land on but the Carla website? And the Carla website had some cool pages at that time about critical thinking, and curriculum design and all that. And then that's just how I got to know Carla and ended up going to the University of Minnesota for my PhD. Um, and while I was doing my PhD, got into learning about content-based instruction. Of course, I got to study with Dee Teddick, who's a prominent immersion scholar and writes a ton about content-based instruction. And but I always preserved my focus about what am I learning? How am I going to bring back to the world language classroom? It's just remained an interest of mine. I was really lucky to get a job at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, where I work. And as I'll talk about, content-based planning is a unified paradigm. There, every language course is a content-based course at the Institute, and I got to experiment a ton in the teaching I've done there, and that's really shaped the work I'm going to share with you today. Um, and yeah, so I think we'll dig right into it. Like Kate said, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. I'm going to stop halfway through and answer some questions at that point, and then we'll save plenty of time at the end. And just the way I conceptualize this is I've got some framing stuff at the beginning I'll share, but I really want this to be show and tell. I'm going to do a lot of show and tell of curricular documents. I really want you to get a vivid sense of the architecture of this unit and the choices I made pedagogically and the things that I pulled together to make this a coherent unit. So let's get started. Let's see if I can move forward. So a few notes about the grammatical syllabus, since this is about predominantly about negotiating a language focus. And I'm going to draw from a paper I wrote back in 2013 in the French Review. And that was a fun paper to write because it was a special issue of the French Review. And the focus was on what is the future of French education in the United States for the next 100 years or something like that. And I took that as a moment to talk about sort of the curricular state of affairs of things. And I argued that we need to finally just let go of the grammatical syllabus as the defining, organizing principle of curriculum design in French education. And so to define the grammatical syllabus, I like this quotation from Wilkins: it accords highest priority to the grammatical criteria and sees the structure of language teaching as being principally provided by an ordered sequence of grammatical categories, right? Um, and so, why does it persist? Why does it stick around? And as I write in that paper, I think there are three main reasons. So, it's kind of a defining feature of our history in foreign language education. So, for my reading, modern foreign language education has been patterned on Latin teaching, right? And so, moving through this just sequence of grammatical concepts has been something that we took and persisted for a long time. Schools are highly conservative institutions too. We know this in a lot of ways, right? Getting things changed in schools, is pretty difficult to do. Um, and uh, and so in terms of making a big curricular change like this, we're sort of swimming up tide sometimes. Um, and then for a lot of people, the quantifiability of a grammatical syllabus is really attractive, right? Like, especially from an assessment point of view. So if I'm meant to make a midterm exam or a final exam, and I can just sort of make something that's multiple choice based on grammatical forms, easy to do, feed into a teleprompter, makes life simpler, right? Means I have to maybe negotiate grades less with students, right? So there's a lot of things holding us back from making a really big change away from that, right? However, I think it's totally worth it. Why? Because I think the grammatical syllabus, I love referencing this paper written by D. Tenick and Connie Walker from Minnesota about, it's called Problems That Plague Us, and this idea that a grammatical syllabus maintains a focus on language as an object rather than a subject of meaningful communication. So, it keeps us in the language analysis realm and, takes us more away from the like actually communicating with people, communicating ideas, learning things, right? Um, it's inconsistent with a lot of compelling findings in the second language acquisition research, right? Let's something sort of a simple, tangible concept is a developmental sequences research that shows that no matter what language you're learning, when you're learning, or what language is your first language, when you're learning a new language, for some forms, you go through these stages, right? And those, in a lot of cases, don't line up with what we see in textbooks, right? Um, We also have this notion I'd like to think of as human laboratories, and I like to rely on data from Castles, another language research center, which shows that the average American high schooler gets to about novice high or intermediate low after 4 years of instruction. Man, that's not great. Say we get students for 4 years and they're only barely able to survive in that language. So my argument there is the status quo is not really doing what we want it to do. So we need to start exploring some other more creative and innovative pedagogies. And I think content-based instruction is the way to go. And given a lot of the research that's out there about the power of content-based instruction, I've just been surprised that it's not been more popular and more taken up in the general, curricular sphere and language education. Um, and so how this relates to textbooks, just a note about this is, so I'm going to argue that still for modern commercial textbooks, and maybe in the chat if or in the Q&A section, if people knows a textbook that really, is kind of breaking away for this, I'd love to hear about it. But a lot of textbooks these days still commercially, they have an underlying grammatical syllabus, right? And communicative clothes are kind of added on top of that, right? So they are made to look more with the times and more innovative and more interesting, but there's that grammatical syllabus under there that's still running the show, I would argue. And the planning I'm going to show you in this presentation is meant to get away from that. All right, so a little bit of a shameless plug here. My book on content-based planning, moving beyond the grammatical syllabus. As Kate said, it's a small book. It's 100 pages long. I meant for it to be really connectable, and for something that people can come back to and study and not feel overwhelmed by, right? But in it, I give a rationale for why I think content-based instruction is so powerful. And first, I'll outline this here. First, it really helps us focus on the development of communicative competence, right? So moving away from language as object. Of course, there's place for language analysis in content-based instruction, but it's really helping us develop proficiency. That's speaking proficiency, interpretation proficiency, right? Interpretive communication, presentational, interpersonal. Um, and I like to draw on a quotation. I think it's from Dalton Puffer in the CLIL literature that talks about bringing the streets into the classroom, right? So the kind of language use we're doing in the classroom is going to look like the language use outside of the classroom, right? Coming back to this idea of underwhelming outcomes, content-based instruction is very promising outcomes in the studies that have been done on it in terms of communicative development and also content learning, right? So why wouldn't that be attractive to us? But then there's a critical thinking aspect. I've talked a lot in my work about how foreign language curriculum kind of sticks in the thinking light sphere, the cognitively small sphere. A lot of those units in commercial textbooks about camping or barnyard animals or travel and they don't get students to think that much. And I like content-based instruction because it gets students to think more if you're bringing in great texts and great questions and whatnot. And I like to think of this concept of horizontal alignment in that I want language classes to be as cognitively interesting as other classes in a curriculum. So it's cognitively interesting as language arts, English language arts, or history or calculus, right? Um, so I think those are some reasons why I see the power of content-based instruction. A couple of notes about the sort of like an identity aspect. I bring up the notion of identity and agency in the book. And I like this quotation from Janelle Reeves. She talks about in teacher education, it should involve helping teachers imagine alternative teacher identities. And she says that such imaginative work can lead to the creation of new, different instructional practices, which are better suited to teachers' contexts and to social justice than the ingrained, but perhaps ill-fitted and inequitable instructional practices in place, right? So I've always seen this really interesting dynamic between identity development and teachers' practices, right? So as we're learning the practices of content-based instruction, I think it's really helpful for us to think about taking on the identity of a content-based teacher, right? And there are sort of three identity positions I like to highlight a lot. Number one's an innovator. I think taking on a content-based approach means we have to see ourselves as innovative people who are trying new, exciting things in the classroom, right? We have to see ourselves as curriculum designers, right? We're not just taking a textbook and following it blindly, and we're doing something new and creative, and we are actively making curriculum for our students. And then also, I argue that we should see ourselves as content and language integrated teachers. right? I'm sure many of you can resonate this, but one of the biggest misconceptions I get is, oh, if you're doing a content-based instruction, the students will learn the language naturally. You don't need to talk about language. And that's not what I'm arguing in this book at all. Talk about language often, explicitly, right? But it's in balance with content. And I want students to learn both content and both language. That's actually a misconception from this title. I really like this title because it connects nicely with my piece from 2013 in the French Review. But sometimes I experience people would see a title like this and say, oh, no more grammar then, it's just all content, right? But that's not the argument I'm making at all in this book, right? Um, so talk about agency as well, the capacity of people to act purposefully and reflectively on their world. That's a quotation by Rogers and Wetzel, which I think is a nice one. We know about agency that it's shaped by the context that you're in. That's really important. And I like this quotation here. When people are able to exercise agency, they can construct the identities they wish to construct. And the reason I bring this up is because I think to bring content-based planning into your sphere, it might involve deploying some really interesting agency, right? For instance, you may teach in a conservative context, or you may teach in a context where you're given a textbook and say, hey, cover chapters 1 to 5 in this class. What are you going to do in that case? What if you want to bring some of these planning principles to the to the plate, and what might you have to do, like in terms of trying to convince people about things, or bringing some stuff into your classroom and experimenting with it, right? So I think these are helpful frames in terms of thinking of taking on a content-based planning in your context. So in terms of the book too, I wanted it to be really practical. And so I lay out a method in it. And it's funny when I listen to podcasts and I hear people talk about books they wrote, there's sort of this thing where people, like, they write the book that they wanted to help them work through a thing that they're working on in their life. And this book was exactly that for me. I actively teach language courses where I work right now in addition to pedagogy courses, and I wanted a codified method for doing that. I wanted a nice approach that was clear and easy to follow. So as I constructed content-based courses, I put together a method, that I think is connectable. And I just wanted to give an overview of that method for you here. Um, the book is broken up in terms of the method part to sort of like 3 chunks. The first chunk is called conceptualizing content at the unit level. The second chunk is balancing language and content at the unit level, and then balancing language and content at the lesson level. Okay. So conceptualizing content at the unit level, things I talk about is developing a rich and engaging theme for your unit. So we're starting with unit planning, right? A rich and engaging theme. So moving away from topics like travel and pastimes to a more engaging theme, something that has intellectual meat on its bones, right? I talk about doing content research. So I'm not trained in content spheres outside really of language education, right? So teaching a class on food insecurity can be quite a bit intimidating, but I read a lot. I have a bachelor's degree, in music, and I learned a bunch through that. I've got a lot under my belt that I'm and all of us are in this sphere, in this teaching sphere. We've got a lot of sort of like core education under our belt that gives us a foundation to build on. Plus, we know how to do research. We can go and we can read and we can learn, right? And so a bit of a commitment to this planning approach means learning some new stuff. So that's part of planning at the unit level. I might talk about using essential questions and enduring understandings. That's from the work of Wiggins and McTighe, foundational tools that I just love drawing upon when I plan curriculum, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then summative assessment planning. And I think that's really important to talk about, to think about when you're planning for the content sphere of your unit, because you're sort of articulating what content students are going to have to bring to the table as they do that assessment. And then you move into the language planning, right? So balancing language content and content at the unit level, we have to do some language analysis, right? So that helps us figure out what our language focus for the unit's going to be. And a key aspect is looking at that summative assessment. What are the language functions embedded in that summative assessment? What grammatical forms support that language function, right? So we get to do some language analysis. We get to articulate our learning goals. We get to balance those learning goals. So if we're looking at skills, we're looking at knowledge. Following Williams and McTighe, we get to make sure content and language are both represented in those. So if I'm articulating skills goals, students need to know core statistics about food insecurity in Francophone countries. Students need to know, stuff like that. But they also need to know, for instance, how to form the conditional in French, because that's knowledge that's going to help them in a language way accomplish the communicative acts of the unit. Um, and then I talk about additional assessment planning and balancing language and content at the unit level. So formative assessment techniques that help me keep tabs on students' concepts, language, and development. And then as a third part, I move into lesson planning, right? Sort of seeing that backward design approach here. And there we talk about writing objectives for the lesson level, sequencing activities in the lesson level, and then doing a quality control of the unit. So going back to frameworks from like dietetic, the Capri framework. So I think that's still hosted at the Carla website. It's a curriculum design framework that you can look at and then look across lessons to make sure things are balanced and integrated. Also, Where To framework from Wiggins and McTighe to go back, look at all the lessons of a unit, and make sure they're hitting all the marks that you want them to hit. That's sort of a big, broad overview of the method I put together. And like I said, the book is it's connectable, it's short. If you want more details, go back to the book, and it's available. There's digital copies in addition to hard copy and softcover copy as well. So I did want to, since this presentation is largely about negotiating a language focus, I did want to sit for just a couple of minutes on how to figure out a language focus when I'm planning, right? So I'm putting together this content-based unit. I brought together a ton of content. How do I figure out what language to focus on, right? And I'm going to argue there are a couple of things. So there's the summative performance task. I already said, what are the language functions evoked in that text, in that task? What grammatical forms support those functions? The authentic texts themselves. So I pulled together a lot of authentic texts to support my unit. What language is embedded in those unit? What grammatical forms are there? What vocab surface is there? Prior curriculum, I'm thinking of the work of Snow, Met, and Genesee, looking at content compatible, content obligatory things, right? So the summative performance task, that's telling you the obligatory stuff, but you can look back to what was studied previously in the curriculum and fold it in contextually into the new unit in a content compatible way. And then the students themselves, I'm going to argue the students themselves are key players in telling you what language to focus on, and pulling all this together comes to this interesting idea of like triangulating a language focus. I love that phrase, triangulating a language focus, because I'm pulling all these data sources about how I could focus on language, and then I'm having to make some strategic decisions. So, um, all right. In terms of the context, I'll talk about the context in the course a little bit. I work, like I said, at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and all of our language courses are content-based. It's been so fun to be able to teach there, and to just experiment. So I've taught this course on food insecurity twice. I also taught a course on social issues in contemporary Quebec at MIS, which was really exciting. That was fun. I also taught some English courses there as well on public speaking, and that's influenced what I've done in French, which you'll see in a minute. But students who come to us, I'm in the language teaching programs, so future language teachers, but we have students who are studying nonproliferation, anti-terrorism, international policy, international education management, international trade, diplomacy. So these language studies courses are geared primarily towards our international policy students. So I meant to choose subject matters that are relevant to their lives as future professionals working in Francophone countries, right? So I did a needs analysis for my students to help me triangulate a language focus, right? And so I talk about student preferences and student wants. So if I go back here, if I get to here, just to explain what I did in terms of student preferences. So this is the table of contents from a book called the Grammaire progressive du français, which is a progressive French grammar, right? And so it's just sort of a manual that goes through all these different grammatical pieces, right? It's really organized and nice. And what I did is I gave, the students had the book and I said, hey, go home, tell me what out of this you want to study, right? What do you need more help with, right? And so these are intermediate level students and these are adults, right? They're in their mid to 20s and beyond. So I was able to do that with them, and they've had, experience with French. They've had several French classes before. A lot of them did our summer immersion program in Vermont. So they've got a handle on a lot of these things. So I could trust that they could do some self-identifying of things that they wanted to study, right? I wanted to give them the space to say, hey, oh yeah, I studied, the subjunctive, before, but I need more work on it. So I want to identify that as something to focus on. So this was part of my needs analysis process. Hey, students, what do you want to focus on out of all these possibilities here, right? And this manual really helped that. The manual also really has a cool, a little about diagnostic quiz at the end that corresponds with all of the, things that it approaches. Um, and so I gave them this quiz and course. It's sort of just like fill in the blanks quiz here. And it told me exactly what chapters in the book it corresponds with. And this provided me data about where the students might be lacking in their language development too, right? So that was telling me, okay, the students kind of need more help with this, right? So they're self-identifying, but I'm also seeing in their performance on this quiz where they need some help as well. And this sort of patterns on to the student preferences is the wants aspect of a needs assessment. The diagnostic quiz is the lacks element, and then there's the needs element of a needs assessment. I'm thinking of like Nation and McAllister's book on curriculum design, and the needs comes through looking at the performance task. What do they need? What type of language do they need to succeed well on that task? So pulling it all together for a needs analysis. Just some overarching design principles that I brought to the table here. Backward design, you've probably heard me use a lot of those terms already. It's really important to me, right? So these three stages articulating what do I want my students to know and be able to do. Then I move to how am I gonna, see that they can do those things and they know those things or they've cultivated a deep understanding. And then I'm going to move to planning my lessons and my sort of weekly learning experiences. Thematic planning, right? That's sort of the paradigm we're in language education these days, and it dovetails very nicely with the Wiggins and McTighe's work. I draw from a ton of authentic texts. That's really important. Language, use in the wild, right? And to muck through. Um, I do a little modification of the text. Maybe, we're looking at part and not a whole, but I don't really do much, glossing and or changing of the language. What I do is I do a lot of work in class to help students cultivate interpretation of those texts. So it's a kind of a high challenge, high support approach. And the students sometimes they're like, "Oh my God, this is a lot." They're intermediate low speakers, and they're mucking through a policy text. But I really kind of like putting that challenge in front of the students, and I think it's really important to normalize that challenge because I think in language pedagogy we've been a little afraid to do that in the past. So I enjoy that, and I think the students enjoy it too. Performance tasks, real world performance tasks from a Wiggins and McTighe's framework are really important to me. I want my assessment, especially the summative assessments, to be rooted in real life performance, especially working at a professional graduate school. But I want these bigger, high stakes, end of unit type things to be something that students are going to have to do out in the world. That dovetails nicely with language functions, right? So a functional approach to teaching language, where what are the things they need to get done with language, and then that points me towards morphosyntax and it points me towards lexicon, right? I'm not saying this is passé composé day, we got to work on that. I'm saying, oh, they have to tell a story about the past, so they're going to need the passé composé and then the impalpé, right? And then finally, like I said, I taught some public speaking courses at the Institute, and I wanted to bring some of that work into this French course. Those were English courses. So in foreign language education, we have presentational speaking as a key aspect of our standards and our curriculum, but I don't ever see presentational speaking addressed with the robustness that you would see in a public speaking course. And I wanted to bring a lot of those concepts in terms of the genre of putting together an informational speech or a persuasive speech. And yeah, so I brought that in, and you'll see elements of that. All right, so what did I end up with? I ended up with a course with 3 units. It was a 15-week course. We devoted 5 weeks to each unit. First unit was food, culture, and identity in the Francophone world. The second unit was food insecurity, policy, and recommendations. And the third unit was humanitarian aid for food insecurity. All right. So what I'm going to do in the next piece, I'm going to stop for a question or two now, but in the next piece, I'm going to show you the second unit, and if time, the third unit, but I want to show you the architecture of the unit and what I drew upon to pull this together, and what language I focused on. So Kate, any questions that came up that maybe I could address now?
There's only been questions about books that like your book and books that you
Mm.
referenced. So I've been trying to keep up with those. And
Oh,
the
cool.
other things that I see in the chat are just how exciting this talk is so far. And so
Cool.
people seem very engaged. There was one
Awesome.
comment from somebody when you were talking about the grammatical syllabus saying that,
Mm.
yeah, it's been the same scope and sequence for the past 50 years. We
Hmm.
disguise it as thematic, but it's
Yeah.
really a functional grammar syllabus.
Hmm.
But otherwise I don't see any questions. Oh wait, hang on. Here we go.
Hmm.
This one. I would ask whether you would use teacher created materials that are not authentic, especially for beginning learners.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an appropriate place for those. If we look at the research on authentic text and second language acquisition, I'm thinking specifically to Alison Chantania's book on SLA. They talk about a text that we bring into class has to be workable for language learning in terms of providing at least some comprehensible input, right? And like students need to, there's like a level of understanding that needs to happen before something becomes workable as input, right? And so with beginners, sometimes a modified text provides more input that they can work with, and that's appropriate. That being said, the flip side of that is that, bringing in authentic text and then we're developing partial comprehension, and that's fine, right? Like we have to get comfortable with, I think, that partial comprehension aspect. So I think there's a balance there to be had. My one fear and pitfall with a modified text is if it strips it of things like the cultural aspect, right? If it strips it principally of the critical thinking aspect too, you know? Like if I think to what's really popular, some of those like graded readers, they have stories that people follow. Those don't really have a much of a critical thinking aspect to them, and that's where I get nervous to use those as like cornerstones of a curriculum, right? Rather than like things that come up as part of a curriculum, right? So I think one just has to be really careful about modifying text if a critical thinking based curriculum is your goal.
So there's a couple more questions that have come in, Jason.
Hmm.
One and two of them are kind of related, but I'm just going to ask one of them. So
Hmm.
this is a question from Mandy who said, one of the things that I'm thinking about is how to potentially align various topics within a common multi-section course.
Hmm.
How might you align content horizontally, and how might you allow for differing content expertise on the part of the teachers? And I would add, maybe how would you allow for differing implementation of the content by the
Hmm.
teachers who might want to personalize it?
Yeah, yeah. So I get to this in the conclusion of the book too. So that's if I don't fully answer it enough here, check out the conclusion where I elaborate that in the book. Um, but a couple of things that come to mind is, with lots of people on a team working together is sort of a team approach where people can pool their expertise and come together and make a greater than the sum of its parts thing. So a a group-based approach to curriculum design. God, I have to. I don't know if I remember exactly the things. There's like multiple layers I give in that conclusion of the book about ways you can sort of like make things systematized across multiple sections, right? So you could systematize at the level of the course title, you can systematize at the level of units used in the course, and then you can systematize everything. And so just to elaborate that a little bit, for instance, so okay, here are my 3 units in my course. Say somebody else is teaching another section of this. um, Maybe the other teacher and I, we agree that we're going to use these 3 units and we're going to use the same performance tasks. However, given the students I'm working with, I may use slightly different authentic texts, right? And if, big part of it too is having them go and find their own text and bring in some of their own research, you know, that's going to pan out differently in each section, right? And maybe the language foci are going to be a little different. Maybe I learn, halfway into the unit that the language foci, I had planned and thought would be helpful. Students already mastered that, so I need to extend. So I need to bring something else in, right? So I think in your context, in your group, you have to decide what level of systematicity you're going to want and how comfortable you are with that. You know what I mean? Like, I think, people will say, oh, is it going to be fair across sections? How's that going to work out? But it all kind of comes down to what your learning goals are and how you're designing a grading structure too. You know what I mean? So like if your grading structure is really tied to them learning very specific morphosyntax things and lexical things versus them improving communicative competence, that's much different stories, right? Like if my grading structure is built around them putting maximum effort into a task and showing they made improvements in their language control, cool. I don't, that's just going to be based on the student, and it doesn't matter as much how it's going to compare to other students. But if it's like, how did, this student demonstrate specific understanding of these five vocab words and this one grammar point, and I need to compare across all students for that, then that becomes more of an issue. So, man, there could be a whole talk on this, I would say, and I don't think I'm giving it justice in the answer I just gave right now. I think this is a complicated one, and just given the time we have, and I should probably move on. I'd say probably go check out that chapter of that book at the end, and then I'd be happy to talk more about that and think more about that if you want to make a Zoom call. So, Kate, should I move on? Make sure we have time for the
Yeah, there's some more
rest.
questions, but let's
Cool.
hold them to the end because we want you to get through your content and then we can.
Sounds great. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you. Love that question though, and love to talk about that. And also, I should say one thing I should say about that question is I realize I work in a very unique context. I work in a context where I don't have to worry about that. I can make my title, I can design as much new curriculum as I want. I don't have to worry about normalizing across sections. I get that if you're working at a very large university with 10 sections of Spanish 1, that's a different story. You know what I mean? So I will totally admit here that I have a different context, but I don't think what I'm proposing here is fully unworkable in that different context, right? Okay, so let's look at Unit 2 and the architecture of that, specifically Unit 3 if we have time. Just to remind us, Unit 2 is this food insecurity policy and recommendations. And this is the a unit where we started to really look at what the concept of food insecurity is, what policies are built around it, and then what people are putting out there in terms of what should be done about the problem, right? And so I framed it with some essential questions, and to translate these, like, what is the state of food insecurity in the Francophone world, right? How can we resolve food insecurity in the Francophone world? These are guiding questions that were explicit right from day one, that I present to students on day one, that orients the curriculum. And with each new input and each new discussion we have, students are refining their thoughts and they're getting closer and closer to answers to these questions, right? So these were a curricular framing tool for me. Um, and then I pulled together a performance task, which I've got hyperlinked here. So I wanted to show you this in detail. This is the performance task, the summative performance task for the unit. I made sure it was in English because I wanted students to be able, or at least the description of it's in English, so students could go back to it and just be very clear. But at the end of this unit, I'll just read this part. You are tasked with conducting research on the state of food insecurity in a Francophone country of your choice, which you will present to a superior in your organization. Write a brief policy memo in which you explain your findings and make recommendations to your superior. So a couple of things to tease out in here. So I wanted them to have, some agency here. I wanted them to get to choose a country that they wanted to focus on in the Francophone world, right? Some chose countries in Africa, some in Europe, right? Um, and then I wanted them to contextualize it in a way that was interesting to them. So if they see themselves working, for instance, at the United Nations, who's their superior there? They ran into the Secretary of State, somebody at some different office, right? Um, and then I did my research, like I was saying, in terms of I went to talk to other program chairs in my institution, in environmental policy and nonproliferation and whatnot, to see what are the genres that they use in their degree programs. And I learned about a policy memo. That's a big genre that they have to write in. And so I wanted to bring that authentic genre into my course, right? And so this sort of is a bit of the genre, that has to have a header, who's it to, including role, who's it from, who are you in this organization, right? There's a title, there's a summary of the memo. Then in the back, there's a background and context section where they talk about we have to identify the country, give information about the state of affairs of food insecurity in the country, and then explain the relationship between climate change conflict and food insecurity in that country. And then there's a recommendation section, which, talks principally about statements about how to make it better, how to solve the problem, right? And so one of my non-proliferation colleagues provided me with a sample that they use in their own classes, right? When they're teaching in their just content courses, students how to write a policy memo. This is something they would use. We looked at this together in my French class and we pulled it together, or we, analyzed it and did a genre analysis and figured it out. And I wanted this to be a clear model that they had as they were working on their thing, right? So this is my performance task. All of the stuff we did in the unit leads up to this. I want all of my lessons to prepare them to succeed as much as possible on this task. This is a real world performance task, which is getting them to do things that they would have to do out in the world as policy professionals, international policy professionals, right? And oh, so before I do go away from that, I want to show how language and content are integrated in here, right? So I've got a lot of genre-based stuff, but content-based stuff. So they have headers and titles, that genre stuff, summary, they have that's a genre aspect, right? Titles, but then getting into the content, they have a main body section with 2 to 3 paragraphs outlining the food insecurity landscape. They had to do research. They have to bring in new information, right? But also rely on the text that we studied in the unit. um, then they have to give recommendations, right? They're having to synthesize this information and come up with ways, that would help solve the problem, right? Then there's a bunch of language stuff, right? So logical relationship words, and I'll explain this in a minute. The conditional form in French, the subjunctive form in French, vocab, right? So these are all language aspects we worked on in the unit that are linked to this specific performance task. But what I really want you to see here is the emergence of language from the performance task, and the fact that the performance task is both a language and a content endeavor, right? That's what's really key here. Okay. So that was the performance task in the unit. And then in terms of authentic texts, just to give you a sense of like the types of texts that we looked at, this is not all of them. I just picked a couple just to show the range. But we started by looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations to see where in there they talk about food as a human right, right, and to talk about the dynamics of that. How does that get operationalized? Is really interesting. We looked at a lot of text from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, right? And what's so cool is through the UN, so many of their core texts are in French as well as in English, right? So we're looking at this text, which was foundational concepts in food insecurity. The availability, access, use, stability, right? Some cool infographics to help make sense of these things, right? Some cool like scales and whatnot. And this text is kind of dense, right? And uses a lot of domain specific vocabulary, but we're developing comprehension slowly. And I'm working with students in class to help them make sense and wade through it. And they're not going to get everything. And I'm totally fine with that. And then what's so cool is when you're teaching in this content-based way and bringing in all these authentic texts, you get a ton of recycling of vocabulary. So a word that they're seeing in this, they're going to see 3, 4, 5 more times in the next text that you bring in, right? Had this little video. This one was on is climate change menacing food insecurity? Menacing, that's is threatening in English, right? And just to give a little sense, you can hear this, right? Yeah, so it was just like a brief little video, and here I can play with the playback speed. I have
Parce qu'un des
subtitles
impacts les
going
plus
here. You can hear
dévastateurs
him
du changement
talking,
climatique,
right?
c'est sur
So
l'agriculture. Toute variation, même infime, de la température ou de la pluviométrie va avoir des conséquences dramatiques pour les récoltes.
Icons, harvest is a word that came up over and over again, right? I loved seeing it in these multiple texts. I used the closed captioning. I would slow down the speed. So I'm using all these scaffolding tools to help develop comprehension of this text, right? Then another text we used in this, famine, is s'installer is to like to root in prolonged conflict areas in Africa. And so here's a map of where, showing the relationship between conflict and famine, right? So this is really highly connectable with lower proficiency learners. Lots of, like using a graphic organizer, lots of visuals to help support understanding, right? Some more graphics and whatnot. So just to give you a sense of the types of like authentic text I was drawing upon in this unit, I think what to take away from this is we just dove into these, right? I think sometimes I'd hear people say, "Oh, that's way above my students' level if they're intermediate low," and I would just encourage you to dive right into that. Okay. And then in terms of language foci, there was a lot of language to pull apart. So I think I have these queued up as well. So relation logique, these are like logical connector words in French. So like because, since, thanks to, right? It's because of this, or this is the reason for which, right? So there are all these like nitty gritty, phrases that connect things in French and show relationships between ideas. And what's amazing is how much these words show up in these texts that are outlining the state of affairs of food insecurity in these countries. So I wanted them to have this as a tool to write that policy memo, right? If you're outlining the state of affairs of food insecurity in a Francophone country, these are words that are going to help you do that. It's because of prolonged conflict that there's a famine in this country, right? Okay. Then we also looked at the conditional form and the subjunctive form, especially with the il faut que use of subjunctive. It's important that as ways to give recommendations, because in the policy memo they have to give recommendations about how to solve in food insecurity. So maybe they're taking the subjunctive and they're saying it is important that the local government do X, Y, and Z, right? So these grammar forms, I focused on them because they're tools to help complete the summative performance task, and also the students voted for these. These are two of the most highly voted things in that student preferences survey I gave. So that's where this triangulation aspect of the language focus came in. Is I felt like it was triangulated because the summative performance task called for it, and then the students themselves voiced interest in studying these things, right? So I felt really good about that. So that's the language, the sort of like grammar-y stuff, and then vocab, is just an ongoing thing. And my process I use with vocab development in this course is we co-construct a class Quizlet every unit for each new unit. And so for homework, every time they're meant to take words that are interesting and recurring in the text and make a card for it on Quizlet, and they put it's part of speech, where I think there's the example part of speech, an English representation, a sample sentence in French using the term and related words in French, and I have them use word reference and the TV5 Dictionnaire, the French dictionary, to do this. And Languet is a really cool website I've used for that as well. But then we co-construct as a class this whole set of domain-specific vocabulary for this subject area, and they study this, right? That's part of the homework, and we bring it up in class when we can. And then if we go back to that performance task, they're meant to use some of those words in the performance task, right? And I asked them to highlight it in blue so I could get to it really quick when I have to grade it. So these language forms are all forms that we practiced in the unit, and they're meant to use those and show that they can use those when designing this summative performance task. So looking at the time, I'm going to move forward, but that's sort of the main construction, right, of how I got to this language focus in this unit. I'll briefly go through unit 3, because I do want you to see that too. That was the one on humanitarian aid. So the essential questions were, what is the state of humanitarian aid in the French speaking world, and is this humanitarian aid effective? That was a big part of this unit, was like, what is the quality of this humanitarian aid? Performance task here, they have to give a persuasive speech trying to convince us to fund a certain humanitarian aid organization. That one was really fun to put together, and I brought together a bunch of stuff from my persuasives, I don't have it queued up, but a bunch of stuff from my presentational speaking course in the English course I taught. And so I was evaluating them on using Monroe's motivated sequence for constructing a persuasive speech. And we did a bunch of genre analysis of a persuasive speech, and they had to do things like Monroe's motivated speech, if I'm remembering correctly. You have to sort of visualize what the solution can look like, and you have to, I'm not remembering it off the top of my head, but there's like 5 parts of it that we talked through, right? And then I connected language to that. What language forms help you visualize, right? And those language forms, for instance, are like hypotheses, right? And so if we funded this organization, things would look this way in this country, right? That just was such a seamless fit for language focus with, this Monroe's motivated sequence. And the gerundive form, the ing form in French, corresponding in English, students wanted to study that, didn't really fit with a genre, but I folded it in. You can always contextualize something, right, into your unit. And I did that because the student said, hey, I want to study this. So I made this unit. And these are the texts we looked at, some cool TikTok texts. I tried to balance listening videos with reading texts. So that was fun. And then, so to wrap up, so we have enough time for questions. So the thing I keep coming back to is I think it's so important I keep saying this phrase. I don't know if I've heard it somewhere, or just, it's just a me thing, but doing teaching with students, not to students. And what I mean by that is I want my teaching, my curriculum design, to have student voice front and center in it. And I feel like the curriculum I just showed incorporated student voice in a lot of ways, right? They got to tell me what are some of the language things they want to study, right? And I made space for that in the curriculum. By doing a certain degree, they're telling me that they want to focus on issues of nonproliferation and environmental policy and trade, in their futures. And I'm making space for that in this course, right? In terms of recommendations, for you, if you want to adopt an approach to teaching like this, I think deploying your agency is really important. So if you're in a lockstep curriculum context and you want to do something like this, you may have to advocate. You may have to say, hey, here's some curriculum I've seen used. This looks exciting. Can we try this out? Can you carve some space out? And you have to convince people, convince a program chair, convince a section leader, convince a principal, right? So you may get a no, right? An agency is restricted by context. So in some cases, you may not be able to do exactly what you want to do, but you get to try, is what I would argue, right? I would experiment in community, use people around you to try things out. And to get feedback, right? And to continually refine. Lesson study could be a really cool framework here. And then also focus on building an identity. So come back and really relish in the fact that, hey, I'm being a curriculum designer right now. I'm being an innovator right now. I'm being, content and language, a balanced practitioner here, right? And I recently learned about something called self-perception theory, which is really neat. This idea that we build an identity not necessarily by looking at other people, but by looking at what we're doing and the actions we're taking. And I would argue the more we try out content-based planning things, the more we see ourselves doing those things, we're helping ourselves build an identity as a content-based practitioner. So there we go. Sorry for if I spoke too quickly, but there was a lot I wanted to get through there. And we got about 8 minutes left for questions, so we'd love to to take some questions. And here's my email address up here, jmartell@middlebury.edu. Please reach out with any questions. I'm happy to Zoom or chat. So yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen here so you can have a bigger view here. And Kate, yeah, any questions come up?
Hey, Jason. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. So I have a question that's related to that sort of last statement that you made about teach with your students, not to your
Mhm,
students. And this was a question from Thomas. I think they had to leave, but
mhm,
the question is, I think the question is in reference to the needs analysis and sort of customizing the content of your course to your students' needs and wants and gaps.
mhm.
And the question is, it seems that the key is how to quickly take the student interest and then turn it into the units that you're teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how did you do that? Like, did you already
Mhm.
have those units prepared and then you had places in
Uh-huh.
the unit where you could plug things in? Like, what was your process for that?
Yeah. So yes and no. This was the second time I taught the course, so I had a lot of stuff developed. But the first time I taught the course, I had to come up with a lot of this, right? I had to meet with people in other departments to figure out the genres in their programs, right? I had to research authentic texts and pull them together. So I had to do a lot of on-the-fly curriculum design. So here's where context is important, right? I teach at an institution where this is a very easy part of the fabric of doing it. Not easy. It's not easy to do it, right? Because it requires work. But I see these students twice a week for 2 hours each. I'm not seeing them every day for 45 minutes. I don't have as many preps. I realize that a higher education prep load and workload is different in the teaching aspect than if you're teaching in a K-12 school, for instance, or potentially in another context. So I fully realize that I have more bandwidth and a little bit more time to do on the fly curriculum design. um, so if you're in a space where you don't have as much time, it may be advocating for release time, or some sort of, an extra prep to try to work this out. You might have to advocate for something in your context to give you the time to do it. That being said, it becomes way easier with practice, right? Like, I think there's a getting over the hump of it, which is kind of like, holy crap, you want me to do what? Like it really is a bit intimidating at first if you're looking at all these things to pull together. But I think once you get more control with the concepts, and also from an identity perspective, there are a couple of identity shifts that can happen in you that I think can help facilitate the process. One is there is no possible way I am going to know more about these topics than my students. They're the ones in these degree programs. So I had to just let go of this like need to feel like I'm an expert in food insecurity. I'm doing my best and I am pulling together some core information, core text from respectable organizations that are authoritative voices about these things, and I can rely on that. My key aspect is this teacher in this course is I'm learning some about food insecurity, but I'm helping them the students develop their language to make sense of this new information, but also share their expertise on that topic as well. So when I sort of take the fangs out of that expectation a little bit, this becomes easier. Um, and know that it's just a process and that you're learning through it. I do get, I'm wary about misinformation. I don't want to teach them wrong things about food insecurity, but then I just have to sort of know where my boundaries are about that and adjust my identity accordingly. So those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, we think relinquishing our need to be the only expert in the room is really important
Yeah.
when we're doing this kind of work. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's a couple of questions about grammatical sequencing. And I know you're talking about moving away from the grammatical
Mm-hmm.
syllabus, but the reality is, and I think this is probably the reality for a lot of people in this meeting, that we do have to write syllabi that focus on language development. Many of us are coming at this from a language perspective first, with content being
Hmm.
added into the language course. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about courses where we do need to think about grammatical sequencing, particularly when we have students who aren't at the intermediate low level yet, and
Hmm.
how we can do a CBI approach that brings
Hmm.
content into the language course. We're teaching language through content as opposed to teaching content through language.
Yep. Yeah. So a couple things that come to mind. So Miriam Met has a cool continuum of CBI, right? With language-driven programs on one end and content-driven programs on the other. And sort of like the differences to what's the main focus. Are you building curriculum focused mostly on language, like what you're just explaining, Kate, or are you building, curriculum mostly focused around the content stuff, right? They have these concepts of content obligatory, content compatible. And in these language focused programs, the way CBI gets iterated a lot is we have our grammatical syllabus and we bring content in as a way to contextualize that language practice. So the focus is still on like, hey, I got to get better at the passé composé in French, but I'm going to bring in these authentic texts to help practice that, right? So that's a way to do it, right? You could preserve your grammatical syllabus, and you could just bring in these cool contexts to help practice those grammar forms, and you can survey your students to figure out what those contexts could be. So that could be your needs analysis is, hey, you can provide them some examples or learn from them freshly what they want to do, and then find authentic text and context to do that. That's one way to go about it. But one other caveat I will put out there is, I think in our new multimodal world, especially with more hybrid teaching, online teaching, um, the notion of a syllabus is changing a lot. And what I put on my syllabi as pre-planned things these days is very different than what I did in the past. And things get iterated more in a Canvas course, even in a hybrid, in a face-to-face space, they get built out a little bit more. So as the syllabus as a genre changes, I would be interested to see what people can um, not necessarily have to pre-front or pre-plan for a course. Like, so you had said the phrase like making a syllabus for a course. It's fully possible to make a syllabus that doesn't have predetermined grammatical structures on it, unless that's an expectation of the context, I would argue, right? So as the syllabus genre evolves, maybe some of this type of planning might become more possible if students are becoming more comfortable with not everything to the T articulated right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us back to the question that Mandy had asked, and actually there's another question in the chat related to this about like, how do you manage multi-section courses
Yeah.
where we're all doing the same assessments and we have to, I mean, I don't want to talk about coverage, but it's something that you have
Mm-hmm.
to think about, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think context is
That's
so
right.
important when we're thinking
Yep.
about CBI, right? Like these kinds of approaches. So there are more
Totally.
questions, but we are out of time. So if you have a pressing question for Jason, he did provide his email address. It's also in the chat if you're interested in contacting him. I want to really thank Jason for this great talk. There's been all kinds of positive comments going through the chat about how wonderful this was. And we're just so glad to have you here. And we want to thank everybody for coming today. And we look forward to seeing you at a Carla presentation in the future. Have a great day, everybody. And thanks again, Jason.
Of course. Thank you, everybody. So great to see you all.